Cyprus has been making steps to get as close as possible to the US and the West. It's almost in every sector, foreign policy, the banking sector, as well as security and energy. How do you evaluate these steps so far, and what do you think it should follow?
Well, first of all, I think it's very welcomed. As someone who has been traveling and visiting Cyprus for over 25 years, I'm really pleased to see the progress that Cyprus has made. I am very happy to see that it has new opportunities in its exclusive economic zone for being an energy player, not only for its people and its prosperity, but for the region and beyond. I think Cyprus is moving extraordinarily well with not just U.S. but international norms on banking and money laundering questions, and I think that's very important for its future. And so we applaud where Cyprus is headed, and we welcome it, and we want to continue, as we have for some time, to engage it in that course of progress, prosperity, security, and being a significant partner with the United States.
Could you explain the reasoning as well as the timing of the bill you introduced? That someone could say it represents a reappraisal of the U.S. foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Well, we have always had a deep relationship with Cyprus. So we have appreciated, for example, when we have had to take Americans out of neighboring countries, that Cyprus has been a welcoming place in emergent moments. We appreciate our cooperation on intelligence and counter narcotics and terrorism issues. But this is an opportunity to create a strengthened security architecture in the region among like-minded countries. So when we speak of Cyprus, when we speak of Greece, when we speak of Israel, by way of example, we are talking about countries who share our values, share our ideals, are democratic in nature, and seek security simply for peace and the opportunity that peace brings to prosperity as well. So the fact that Cyprus, as an EU member, and has moved forward on so many of the critical issues, gives it a great moment in time. It's also about energy cooperation, and its new discoveries gives it a great opportunity, as I said before, not only for the prosperity of all Cypriots, but at the same time to be a regional player as it relates to energy questions. That can be a foundation also for reasons of cooperation, peace, stability, and security. So from my perspective as the author of the bill, I wanted to take all of these realities. Greece has made some tremendous moves, is a strong NATO ally. I wanted to take these opportunities and say the U.S. wants to be a partner with you. It wants to engage even more deeply with you, and we share interests in this regard and values in this regard. So it's a propitious time to do so. And the fact that a long-standing partner like Israel is now part of this as well, I think is a great moment to have a security as well as an energy architecture in the region that only can create greater peace and prosperity.
What's included in this architecture that you're describing?
Well, the legislation calls for cooperation on energy. It calls for ITAR restrictions to be lifted, which means that while Cyprus is not going to be engaged in any major military purchases or changing the nature of its defensive posture, as a nation. It's not seeking to be an offensive, have the offensive powers, but it has their sovereign right to defend itself. As we see countries throughout the world, not just this region, to engage in international norms and to respect international law, and also to move away from some of the malign activities of Russia. And since the Cypriots have often purchased Russian equipment, among others, but Russian equipment because they had no other market, that this is another movement into the integration, the interoperability of allies to be able to use those. It also speaks about creating energy centers here in cooperation in that regard, in a multilateral approach, and a whole host of elements of further cooperation in intelligence and security, in the diversification of energy in countries that obviously have great opportunities to use renewable energies, as well as they find great caches of hydrocarbons. There's also an opportunity to look at renewable energies. So these are all elements of a comprehensive effort to work together in common cause, in mutual benefits at the end of the day, and to enhance that by the actions of the United States in cooperation with its partners in the region.
I was reading some analysis, left and right, suggesting that the bill is best understood as a symbolic move to convince Turkey to come back from the cold. How do you comment on those?
Well, as the author of the legislation, and I can tell you by my Republican colleagues that have joined me in this, and this is a great statement of the interest of the United States Congress in the region, that at a time of sometimes conflict in the Congress about issues, that we have Republicans and Democrats joined together thinking that this Eastern Mediterranean security and energy cooperation is very important for all of our respective countries, that it's more about that and less about Turkey. Of course, one must be clear-eyed about the challenges that Turkey presents under President Erdogan in moving in a direction that is neither Western nor within the full fulfillment of the spirit of NATO. And so one looks at that as part of the equation. But from my perspective, it is less about Turkey and more about the Eastern Mediterranean, about the countries we are engaging, from Cyprus, Greece, Israel, Egypt, and others who have common causes in energy, common causes in security, common causes for prosperity, and less about Turkey. We don't let any other country determine our collective future. We get to choose our collective future with each other.
How much of a priority is it for you, this bill? And when should we expect it to get on the floor? And if it's going to be a positive outcome at the end of the day?
Yeah. Well, it's at the beginning of this new Congress. The United States Congress begins a session every 2 years. This is the beginning of a new Congress. It is the only, I believe, the second piece of legislation that I've introduced in terms of the context of foreign relations. It speaks volumes. One of my pieces of legislation is on Venezuela, and that is a humanitarian crisis and the antithesis of democracies like Cyprus, like Greece, like the United States. So that was in response to that challenge in the Western Hemisphere, but this is a positive response to the opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean. So from my perspective, it's that important that it became, of everything that's happening in the world, that it became one of the first pieces of legislation. Under our process, we will go through hearings of the legislation, and then hopefully a markup, a vote in the Foreign Relations Committee that will then send it to the Senate floor. A similar bill is being introduced in the House of Representatives, again in a bipartisan nature, a Democrat and a Republican join. I think there's a lot of support for the legislation. And then we will work with the administration to make sure that it embraces what we're trying to do. I think it's an extension of the recent visit that the Secretary of State had at the Trilateral recently and participated in that Trilateral. I think, it is my expectation that we will succeed. Of course, the legislative process in the Congress is not a lightning process. It takes a little time, but I'm optimistic that we will have success. I think there's a great deal of interest in the United States Congress on a bipartisan basis about the opportunities and the possibilities for the Eastern Mediterranean.
And then we've got S-400 and Turkey. Do you fear that Ankara's new armament programs could change the balance of power in a way that it could destabilize the region? And if yes, what should the U.S. respond be?
Well, on a bipartisan basis, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and myself as the ranking member, which means the senior Democrat, as well as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee of the Senate and the senior Democrat of that committee, we penned an op-ed together where we made it very clear that our aspirations for Turkey are that it be oriented to the West, that it can be a bridge between the East and West, that it is a NATO ally, but it has to act as such. Under U.S. law, which I helped write, purchases of major military weaponry from Russia is sanctionable under U.S. law. If Turkey ultimately decides to follow through on its purchase of the S-400, it will be sanctioned under U.S. law. And it is not a discretionary issue, it is a mandatory issue. I think that the Trump administration has also spoken rather strongly about that reality. Now, that's not our desire. Our desire is for Turkey that has been offered other systems, including U.S. systems for defensive purposes, that it would seek that course. But the S-400 is neither interoperable under the NATO alliance, so it affects not just the United States, but it affects NATO in that regard. It affects its neighbors in the region. And it will, if it pursues the purchase, it will dramatically hurt their defense manufacturing center and development center because of everything that will take place. Not only sanctions, but that will be the end of the F-35. There will be no F-35 that can be sold and placed next to an S-400. That would be a risk to our national security interests and those of NATO who have used or purchased the F-35. We cannot permit that to take place just simply as NATO. So we believe that this is a wrong course for Turkey to take. It's a sovereign nation. If it decides to take that course, fine, but there will be consequences for it. And so we hope that that doesn't end up being the story. In the interim, we are prepared that if that's what they decide, that there will be actions as a result of it.
Speaking about NATO, can you see the prospect of Cyprus getting any near to NATO or the cooperation for peace?
I could see a pathway forward in the future. Of course, we recently signed a letter of intent, which I think is another significant step. The Eastern Mediterranean initiative that I'm talking about further enhances some of the security cooperations. So if Cyprus was desirous of building what is necessary to achieve the goals to become either a major non-NATO ally or on its pathway to NATO, it would have the opportunity to do so. But it's a combination of not only having the military wherewithal to be part of NATO, 2% of spending of the nation's GDP, working towards other goals, but it's also about shared values and shared commitments to those values. And so I think NATO could find, Cyprus could find its way on a pathway to that. It just has to decide whether it wants to follow that course. But also as an EU member, it's also a very important participant in our overall security architecture. So it's all possible. It's a new day. I think there's a new day, not just for Cyprus, but for the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a new dawn of opportunities, one in which we are going to be a very vibrant partner.
And 45 years of occupation, of Turkish occupation here in Cyprus. Do you think of any other ways to try and find a solution to the Cyprus problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I'm convinced, as I have often said in the past, that if Greek and Turkish Cypriots were left to their own devices, they would find a pathway forward. They have a common history, they have a common culture as Cypriots, and an identity as Cypriots. And so they have to be allowed to be free to do that. That means that Turkey can have its thumb on the scale. It cannot ultimately, from my perspective, speaking for myself, it cannot ultimately insist on the presence of Turkish troops in northern Cyprus as a perpetual reality. It cannot ultimately insist on the right of intervention. No sovereign nation would agree to that. No EU country would agree to that. So that's a significant obstacle. On the other hand, I think there is real work that can be done for people-to-people engagements, for a continuing sense that Cypriots want to be reunited as Cypriots, and that the more we do in that regard, the more that the government of Cyprus does in that regard, working with its Cypriot compatriots who are in the occupied zone, ultimately can build the strength in which people will tell their governments what they want to achieve. And in the case of Cyprus, it is the government of Cyprus. In the case of the North, they'll tell those who are locally elected by them that this is the deal we want you to make, regardless of what Ankara is saying. But I think that empathy for both sides is incredibly important to continue to develop it, because that is ultimately the foundation of a possibility.